Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game Esoteric and our continuing series on the Steamdeck. More importantly, what emulators you should be setting up and what games you should be playing on them. And today we're going to be taking a look at the Nintendo 64, because while it does have a more limited library than something like the Sega Saturn or the PlayStation 1, there are definitely some awesome games on the platform. If you didn't grow up with it, I'm here to tell you the games I would play. If you've never seen my channel before, it's going to be more esoteric deep cuts, but there will be a few common games in there as well. Before I get too far involved, do me a huge favor, go down below, hit like and subscribe, and ring that notification bell, definitely helps us out. And if you feel so inclined and want to support the channel, you got a Patreon link down below as well. But right off the top, I say this to anybody who will listen, Bomberman Hero is my absolute favorite game on the Nintendo 64. It is 3D platforming perfection, and it's got one of the best soundtracks ever to grace Nintendo 64-bit system. It really just is that good. Now, of course, you could recommend stuff like Super Mario 64, but everyone knows about that game. But not everyone knows about Bomberman Hero or has played it before, and I'm here to tell you it's 100% something you want to do. It is a more slow-paced platformer, but the platforming is excellent, the graphics are cute and colorful, and really take advantage of the Nintendo 64's hardware, and like I said earlier, the soundtrack is so good, they just recently published it on a vinyl record, and I picked it up day one because I love it so much. But Bomberman Hero is the type of game that everyone should play at least once, and it's not going to show up on any best Nintendo 64 games of all time list, and I think that's because games like Super Mario 64 and Banjo-Kazooie take up all the oxygen in the room, leaving absolutely no air for Bomberman to breathe. But this game is just that good. Take my word for it, if you play one game off this entire list, make it Bomberman Hero. But I'm curious what your favorite Nintendo 64 game is. Leave me a comment down below because I'd love to hear it. But I got this game when it came out new, and I fell in love with it, and I've been playing it every couple of years since. And it does a great job of using the Nintendo 64 hardware strengths to its advantage. Really bright, colorful graphics, textures that aren't too muddy. Obviously with emulation they are a bit filtered here, and it's just got that gameplay hook that Nintendo 64 was so good at. The music's incredible, the platforming is incredible, all of the gameplay is solid, and it's a relatively long game as well. It's going to give you 8 to 10 hours of gameplay. But take my word for it when I say Bomberman Hero is one of those games you just 100% have to give it a go. I'm pretty sure you will absolutely love it. If you don't, hey, at least you gave it a shot and you know that you've tried it. But moving on to another fun, cute 3D platformer that's technically more like a 2.5D platformer is Kirby 64. Now this is going to be more of an obvious pick, but it still doesn't get the same amount of attention as something like Super Mario 64 does. I absolutely love this game, and again, it's because it takes advantage of the Nintendo 64 hardware strengths. It looks amazing, it plays great, and of course it's colorful and fun. But being a Nintendo game, it also has that gameplay hook you know and love from them. It is so easy to pick up and play, but it does get relatively challenging later on down the line. You might see those clouds pop in there. Some of these games still do have a couple graphical glitches here and there, but that's kind of just where Nintendo 64 emulation's at. But you can 100% play this game from start to finish, enjoy it, and I think you absolutely will. And I love all Kirby games, but honestly, this kind of 2.5D aesthetic really does it for me. All of the characters are polygons, all of the backgrounds are polygons, but you're still playing on that single field. Sometimes you get a little bit more movement in the game, but for the most part, this isn't something like a full 3D platformer, and I think that really works on the Nintendo 64, and this game is so much better than Yoshi's Story, having that same kind of gameplay design to it. It's one of those things, if you've never played Nintendo 64 before, or if you've never checked out this Kirby game, you 100% owe it to yourself to do it. It is such a fun and cute adventure, and it really is just synonymous with what I think about when I think about the Nintendo 64. But it also has an absolutely spectacular soundtrack, so go ahead and listen for like 45 seconds or so, and I'll come back and show you more Nintendo 64 games you should be playing on your Steam Deck. But enjoy! Just an absolutely spectacular soundtrack. Now, a game that I'm going to recommend you play on the Nintendo 64 for no reason other than to experience it is going to be Cube of War. Now, I know what you're thinking, this is a GameCube game, and that is true, but it started its development on the Nintendo 64, and a few years back, The completed ROM for the Nintendo 64 version was released online, and Cubivore was always a quote-unquote ugly game on the GameCube. They said it looked like it was a generation old in reviews, and that is because it's basically a pivot from a Nintendo 64 game. But I think the graphics of Cubivore work better on Nintendo 64 hardware, and this is an absolutely spectacular evolution sim with like some action platforming involved. It is weird, it is wonderful, it's wild, and on Nintendo 64 and Steam Deck, it is an absolutely great game to play while you're just traveling around, or come home, throw it in your dock, and play it for 3-4 hours. Cubivore is one of those games, there's nothing quite like it. It is absolutely unique and strange, and it is one of those experiences you just need to have. And I always thought when I played it on GameCube that it looked like a Nintendo 64 game, and that is because 100% it was a Nintendo 64 game. And it seems like that many people know this ROM actually came out, so take it from me, play Cubivore on the Nintendo 64. It is a very special game that you're never going to forget playing. Now, of course, it's my channel, and you know we love arcade racing games here, and there are so many different games I could recommend, but I'm going with Beetle Adventure Racing first. This is basically San Francisco Rush meets the Volkswagen brand in almost like a co-sponsored and developed game. You're just doing nothing but racing beetles around, but what I love so much about this game is the tracks and the physics system. It is such a joy to handle with the Nintendo 64 controller or with your Steam Deck. And all of the tracks have such amazing shortcuts. We're talking San Francisco Rush levels of just pure chaos as you're driving around, and a lot of those shortcuts can be very hard to find. This is the type of game that you're going to learn the courses, you're going to understand the racing lines, you're going to find more shortcuts, and you're really going to start enjoying it that much more. And it works perfectly on a handheld system like the Steam Deck as well. All the controls transpose over perfectly, and it is just one of those games. It was amazing on Nintendo 64, but with emulation enhancements, it runs even better. And if you throw it into your dock, you throw it up on your television, it is an absolute blast to play. And this has multiplayer as well, so it's one of those games that you can play with friends and have an absolute amazing time. And compared to a lot of the other racing games on the Nintendo 64, I don't hear as many people mention Beetle Adventure Racing. You're going to hear stuff like Mario Kart, you're going to hear stuff like Wave Race, even California Speed, an amazing game that I think's played much better on MAME or on an original arcade board. But Beetle Adventure Racing was one of those games from the Nintendo 64. It kind of came and went, and I really don't hear many people mention it. But of course, speaking of San Francisco Rush, Rush 2 on the Nintendo 64 is another absolutely incredible racing game. This has so many secrets, so many keys and Mountain Dew cans to collect. You think you would only play this for like 30-45 minutes and move on, but there's so many unlockables and collectibles in the game. It's the type of thing that's going to make you come back and play it for hours. There's way more than you would think in Rush 2, so 100% give it a shot, take my word for it. Now, another game I absolutely love, and I don't hear mentioned as much as I wish, is Space Station Silicon Valley. This is just such a weird action platformer game where you basically play as a computer chip that looks like a spider, and you need to use that computer chip to inhabit other robot animals on the space station you land on, and that's basically the inciting incident that gets this entire game going. One of my favorite parts about this game is it just has an absolutely weird sense of humor. It's definitely tongue-in-cheek. When you actually get into the game, it is absolutely spectacular. It's basically puzzles that you need to solve using the different animals in the game. You start out with one animal, and you're basically going to inhabit dozens upon dozens of other animals throughout your gameplay. We need to use this dog here to attack the sheep because we need to herd some sheep into that pen. But it's a lot easier to herd them into the pen if you kill them and inhabit their body first, and that's the entire hook of this game, trying to understand what animal you need to use next to be able to accomplish your goals. But it has a really fun, really quirky soundtrack as well that I absolutely love, so go ahead and listen for 30 seconds. I'll come back and show you more of this game and a ton of other games you should be playing on your Steam Deck today. It's just such a fun soundtrack, and I especially love the sound effects. It kind of just feels like a Looney Tunes cartoon come to life. But this is just one of those games that is so simple to pick up and play, but all of the puzzle aspect to it, all of the different missions you need to accomplish in a level, just give this game way more depth than you would expect out of something that looks like you're just running around as a robotic sheep. But moving on to specifically robots, Super Robot Spirits. I don't know if it's a good game or not, but it's a very unique game. It's a Japanese exclusive, and it's one of those titles that I just absolutely love for all the weirdest and quirkiest reasons. And you get this absolutely incredible intro here with these budget transformers just popping into the screen. This is based on some sort of franchise from Japan that I'm not familiar with whatsoever. I'm only aware of it from this Nintendo 64 game. But the Nintendo 64 doesn't have a ton of fighting games on it. It is not a system known for them, and the fighting games that are here are not incredible outside of something like Smash Brothers. But there is a lot of fun to be had with this game in 2 players for like 20 to 30 minutes, especially if you got friends over for a game night and you open up a couple beers. Now I will say it's got some of the ugliest backgrounds in a fighting game on any console of this generation, but the actual mechanics are sound and there's a lot of spectacle to be had here. Not only is the fighting on the ground, but you can also launch up into the air and have air battles as well. I do get some slowdown in this game on my Steam Deck, but it also happens on my PC as well. There is some sort of emulation issue here going on, but it's still one of those games that is just such a blast to play. It's weird, it's obscure, it's a little bit janky, and all of those things are what I love about gaming when I recommend some deep cut games. And it's just fun to be able to fly up in the air and start attacking your opponent, but sometimes they just don't come up with you and you have to drop back down. But it's got punches, it's got kicks, it's got grapples, it's got air battles, it's got all the things that a fighting game needs to have to be entertaining. And this is definitely a B- to C+ tier effort, but it's one of those games you should check out at least once. It is fun, and it's one of those things you're never going to forget playing it. The AI is pretty stupid, and you're probably going to be able to beat the game on your first try if you're just playing it on normal mode. But this is the type of game that gets so much better with friends. Like if you have somebody over and you're playing Mario Kart 64, so much better with a human opponent than the AI. And Super Robot Spirits is going to be 100% that exact same concept. So definitely give it a shot. You'll play it for 10-15 minutes, maybe you'll have a little bit of fun. Or if you have people over, maybe you'll play it for an hour and have an absolute blast. Now speaking of Mario Kart 64, we're not going to be talking about that, we're going to be talking about Snowboard Kids, which is basically just Mario Kart on a snowboard released by Atlas and not Nintendo. This is one of those games I grew up with it, I had a ton of fun playing with friends, and it still holds up today. Now I do prefer the original version over Snowboard Kids 2, and that's probably down to just pure nostalgia because I had this game as a kid, and I only came to Snowboard Kids 2 later on in my collecting and emulation life. But this is just so much fun. It is a downhill race on snowboards. You get the same power-ups that you would get in Mario Kart 64. Obviously they're different, but they function in a lot of the same ways. And once you get to the bottom of the course, you take the lift back up, and then you take the entire course again. So it is half a snowboard game, half a racing game, and 100% fun. It also has one of the best soundtracks on the Nintendo 64. Listen, I'll be right back. The soundtrack just 100% works for what this game is going for. It's cheery and bright and colorful, just like the graphics and the character models. But if you read any list of the best racing games to play on the Nintendo 64, you're going to keep seeing Mario Kart 64 over and over again. But Snowboard Kids is every bit as good as that game and does not get talked about near as much. This is just an absolute blast, and it's really indicative of what the Nintendo 64 did, because not as many publishers are making games for Nintendo's console versus Saturn and PlayStation, down to the extreme cost of producing the cartridges versus optical discs. So you got developers trying different things to make Nintendo happy, and Snowboard Kids is one of those games. But the power-ups are great, the courses are well designed, and not only do you get the simple racing mechanics of riding a snowboard downhill, you also get all of the trick elements as well, which are going to help you. I almost put 1080 snowboarding on this list, but for me, I love the crossover between a Mario Kart style game and a snowboard racing game in the same exact cartridge, and that's why I went with Snowboard Kids. Now, of course, everyone's pretty much played GoldenEye on the Nintendo 64, and I'm sure a lot of you have played Perfect Dark as well, but this is one of those games that I just 100% recommend people check out if they haven't. And the great part about the Steam Deck is that the controls all work really well on the deck, and this game upscaled internally on the deck screen just makes it look so much better than we saw on the Nintendo 64, because even though this game required the RAM expansion pack installed in your Nintendo 64, it was still a pretty blurry textured game as far as Nintendo 64 games are concerned. And we get a lot better performance on the Steam Deck, but remember, these were not games that ran at 60 frames per second when they came out, and there's really not much that you're going to do under emulation to get them running at that rock solid 60 frames per second, because that's not how the games were designed. When you're emulating games of this era, you just have to remember that not all of them ran perfectly when they were released, so you are going to get experiences like this that don't run as fast as you would expect modern games to. But once you wrap your head around that and you just get into Perfect Dark, it is one of the best first-person shooters on the Nintendo 64. It's basically GoldenEye 2 without the license, but Joanna Dark here, awesome character, awesome game, and it has multiplayer as well, so throw your Steam Deck in a dock, invite some friends over, start playing, you're going to have an absolute blast, I guarantee it. But it is a hard game as well, be prepared to die over and over again, it's just one of those things, but all of the levels, all of the maps, all of the graphics and music are sheer perfection, and it's just an iconic Nintendo 64 game. And like I said earlier in the video, if you didn't grow up with this system, maybe you missed this one. Take my word for it, play it. If you love GoldenEye, you're going to love Perfect Dark. And if you don't love GoldenEye, I'm really not sure why you watch my channel, as everyone loves that game, but leave me a comment down below and tell me if you don't for some strange reason. Now, if you can't tell already, we're going to be talking about Castlevania 64, and while this game is one of my favorites on the system, I'm not going to sit here and say it's not without its flaws. It definitely has some growing pains as being the first 3D Castlevania game ever made, and putting it up against something like Symphony of the Night from the same generation, it is not as good of a game, but it's a completely different type of game, and you do need to keep that in mind when you were playing it, because back in the day this reviewed poorly, and pretty much still today most people just kind of pass this off as a game you don't need to play. And even though it does have some issues, there's a ton of charm and fun to be had in here, and if you're a Castlevania fan and you've never played it, you 100% have to. And if you're not a huge Castlevania fan, it's still a great platformer on the Nintendo 64 with an absolutely spectacular soundtrack. Listen and I'll be right back. That violin music is just sheer perfection. It does show a lot of what the 64 was capable of in the sound front. But honestly, like I said, this game is not without its flaws. The camera can be a little bit janky, and some of the jumps can be very difficult, but the entire secret to playing Castlevania 64 successfully is just to slow down and make sure you know what you're doing. Don't rush the platforming jumps. Obviously, there's no enemies around. The game is trying to teach you to slow down and take things carefully, but if you rush too far ahead and you don't time your jumps correctly, you're just going to keep falling to your death, which can totally be annoying. I 100% admit that, but trust me, get past the intro area to this game. It super opens up, and it is still one of my favorite Nintendo 64 games of all time. Not without its flaws, but definitely not without its charms either. Now, another game I want everyone to play is Bomberman 64, but not the Bomberman 64 we got in North America. It's a great 3D platforming game, not as good as Bomberman Hero, but still a ton of fun. This is the Japanese exclusive version of Bomberman 64, and if you can't tell already, it's 100% not a 3D platform game. This is the classic 2D Bomberman everyone knows and loves on the Nintendo 64, and I really did want to show a pure 2D game as well, considering a lot of what the Nintendo 64 did was 3D gaming. But this is the type of game, it's an amazing single player experience, but it really shines as a party game. Throw your deck in a dock, you get a bunch of controllers, have your friends come over, and Bomberman 64, the Japanese version, is a spectacular game. And very few people, it seems, know this exists because it's a very hard thing to Google. You basically have to look up Bomberman 64 Japanese exclusive version, and that'll give you results. But if you just look up Mupen64, you're going to get that 3D platformer, and this game is basically not going to show up in the results whatsoever unless you use kanji or search around for certain terms. But if you've ever played a Bomberman 2D game before, this is as good as basically all of the ones that have ever existed outside of Saturn Bomberman being the best Bomberman game of all time. But just take my word for it. Amazing game, amazing with friends, and one that most people don't really even know exists. Now, one game that is a Japanese exclusive that most people do know exists is Sin and Punishment, and this is one of the most iconic Japanese exclusive games on the Nintendo 64 for many very, very good reasons. It's just an absolutely awesome third-person run-and-gun action game that kind of feels like the Nintendo 64's answer to something like Panzer Dragoon on the Sega Saturn. The 3D models, the aesthetic, the vibe, the world building in this game all go to make an absolutely amazing experience, and one that if you've never played before, you totally should. But this game's just an absolute vibe. All of the colorways, all of the different character models, the enemies, the world building in this game is second to none on the Nintendo 64, and even though it is a Japanese exclusive, even if you played in Japanese, you're going to 100% know how to play the game because you don't really need any Japanese language experience to enjoy the action. You run forward, you move left and right, you shoot at things. It's got everything you would want out of a game like this, and it looks spectacular on the system. Now, the last 3D platformer I'm going to talk about outside of all of the ones that would be obvious if you've never played the Nintendo 64 is Chameleon Twist. Now, I'm going to admit right now, this is definitely a B-tier experience. It's not the most incredible game, but it's got some really interesting and unique mechanics to it, and that's a lot of what this generation of consoles was about. Playing around with a new dimension, because before the Nintendo 64, PlayStation 1, and Sega Saturn, 3D was only the domain of arcades, and a lot of developers had never worked with it in a home console environment. And while Chameleon Twist is just an average game, the entire concept of having that long extendable chameleon tongue works so well in a 3D platformer, and I wish we had more games that kind of pivoted around with this. Elevation matters, the direction of the tongue matters, using it both as an offensive weapon as well as a means to circumnavigate the game world in and of itself. It's just so unique, and when you spit that tongue out, you do have full control of it in the 3D space, and there is that puzzle aspect as well, having to move the tongue so that when you swing your character around, they have enough distance to get onto different platforms. But it's also an offensive weapon. Eat enemies with your tongue and spit them out at other enemies as projectiles, and that's how you get through the game. But it also has an awesome soundtrack, and I really do enjoy the bright, colorful nature. Go ahead and listen for 25 seconds, and I'll come back and we'll close out this Nintendo 64 video. It's cute, it's colorful, it has a great soundtrack. It's one of those games that even if you played a ton of Nintendo 64 games before, maybe you haven't come across Chameleon Twist, and that's a lot of the fun of the Nintendo 64 library. There are some amazingly iconic games, GoldenEye, Super Mario 64, Ocarina of Time, and Majora's Mask, but for every game like that that's considered one of the best games of all time, there's a ton of other games you can experience. But take my word for it, if you've never played Bomberman Hero before and you play one game out of this entire video that you haven't checked out before, make it this one. Leave me a comment down below and tell me what games you would have included. Tell me if you think I missed anything, because I always love to hear what your guys' favorite games on a particular system are. Sure, that I'll have more Steamdeck next Saturday. I'll have videos throughout the week as well, but this is what I recommend on the Nintendo 64 on your Steamdeck, and I hope you enjoy them. Bye-bye.